Now, today's talk is part of our Conversations in Forest History series. Our guest today is Laurence Cotton. Laurence is a public historian, and he's the writer and producer of historical films for PBS, and he was a consulting historian or producer on Frederick Law Olmsted, Designing America. And really, with that introduction, I'm going to just turn things over to Laurence.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can see this. Frederick Law Olmsted, Designing America and Bringing Nature to the City. Well, thanks for the introduction, Jamie. I can't quite see all of you today, but it's good to know that there are so many people with us today who are clearly interested in the name Olmsted. It's truly an honor to present to an audience gathered by the Forest History Society. I want to send my thanks to the staff who've made this virtual program possible, in particular, Jamie Lewis, who has put so much into the planning for this occasion. I actually am speaking to you from my home office in Portland, Oregon, but the background is actually a park not far from where I live, Laurelhurst Park, which is part of the Olmsted Master Plan for the city of Portland, although the parks themselves were actually designed by an acolyte of John Charles Olmsted, whose name is Emmanuel T. Mish, who carried forth in the Olmsted tradition here in Portland in the early 20th century. Now, before I go any further, I want to alert you to the fact that April 26, 2022 will mark the 200th birthday of Frederick Law Olmsted. And communities across the US are readying for this. And during the entire calendar year 2022, by the way, it's the heart of it is April, maybe around the time of the birthday, but it's a year-long commemoration. And it's a commemoration of the legacy of all the Olmsteds, the father of the two sons in the Olmsted Brothers landscape architecture firm. My plan today is this. I will review Olmsted's life and career. Then we will explore the Olmsted legacy across North America, including Senior, but again, also the works of the two sons. And then we will spend a little more time in focusing in on certain aspects of the Olmsted legacy in North Carolina, content that is relevant to many of those in the audience today. But first, allow me to introduce Frederick Law Olmsted. Here is a colorful description of the man by his friend, George Templeton Strong, a well-known public figure and diarist of the day. This is George Templeton Strong speaking. He is an extraordinary fellow. Talent and energy the most rare, absolute purity and disinterestedness, prominent defects, a monomania for system and organization. He works like a dog all day and sits up nearly all night and doesn't go home to his family for 5 days together, works with steady, feverish intensity till 4 in the morning, sleeps on a sofa in his clothes and breakfasts on strong coffee and pickles. Well, I don't know about you folks. I probably do occasionally breakfast on strong coffee. I bet some of you do too, but I'm not so keen on having strong pickles also at 6 or 7 in the morning. Well, here is Frederick himself reminiscing on his boyhood. Frederick Law Olmsted speaking. I was a very active, imaginative, inventive, impulsive, enterprising, trustful, and heedless, a troublesome and mischievous boy. I was nominally the pupil of a topographical engineer, but really for the most part given over to a decently restrained vagabond life, generally pursued under the guise of an angler, a fowler, or a dabbler on the shallowest shores of the deep sea of the natural sciences, unquote. Well, that mischievous boy turned vagabond certainly eventually made something of his life. I hope you come away from today's program with a more enhanced feel for this man and what made him tick. Central Park, Brooklyn's Prospect Park, Boston's Emerald Necklace, the White City of the Chicago World's Fair, the park systems of Buffalo, here's Delaware Park in Buffalo, Louisville, Cherokee Park in Louisville, legacy parks in Chicago, here's Jackson Park, the Japanese Garden of Jackson Park in Chicago, Belle Isle in Detroit, nice historic vintage postcard, the Olmsted Linear Park in the Druid Hills section of Atlanta, the Biltmore Estate in Asheville, North Carolina, in Washington, D.C., the U.S. Capitol grounds, the green suburb of Riverside, Illinois, Mount Royal Park in Montreal, the Niagara Falls State Reservation, a New York State Reservation. Those are just a handful of the more celebrated, masterful landscapes designed by Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. But if we add in the park designs and landscapes carried out by his two sons and the Olmsted brothers firm, the imprint across the geography of North America is simply astounding. 700 public parks and 6,000 commissions in the US and Canada. I want to share a few items from media coverage in the past few years with an initial focus on the West Coast. You know, it's interesting to me, though I've lived on the West Coast now for some time, I was raised in New England, and I occasionally travel around the US presenting this program. When east of the Mississippi, audiences there think they own Olmsted, particularly New Yorkers, and I dare say Bostonians and Buffalonians have that same attitude. But the Olmsted legacy does indeed spread across the continent. Just to give you a little bit of a feel for it, on the opinion pages of the LA Times in the fall of 2015, a column was titled "Building a Livable Los Angeles" as we look at LA from the Griffith Observatory. I'm going to quote from a section of this column. Quote, "In 1930, with LA's population on the verge of exploding, the sons of Frederick Law Olmsted were commissioned to draw up a master plan for the Los Angeles basin." Sorry about that. The brothers came back with an intensive study of the ecology of the Los Angeles watershed, including plans for park space, flood control, traffic abatement, recreation, and the city's overall sustainable ecological development. The report was praised for its vision, clarity, and beauty, and it was immediately shelved, unquote. More about that plan for greening LA later in this program. Perhaps someone of our audience read this a few years ago in the New York Review of Books, an article titled "America's Green Giant" by scholar Martin Filler, including discussion of new volumes by and about Olmsted, including this one collection of his writings on landscape, culture, and society. But this is what the author of this review, Martin Filler, wrote. After initially calling attention to the acclaim that has been received by the High Line Linear Park along Manhattan's west side, Filler writes this, quote, "Yet however much the High Line has enriched the post-millennial megalopolis, its social effects pale in comparison to the revolutionary vision of the public park as promulgated by its greatest American exponent, the 19th century polymath, Frederick Law Olmsted," unquote. I expect some of you read this during the COVID winter of 2021, just as the Central Park no doubt looked like just a couple of weeks ago. And in the pages of the New York Times, a moving essay by Michiko Kakutani, who is in fact an avid bird watcher. The heading was "Finding Refuge and a Snowy Owl in Central Park." Here is a longish extract. Quote, "Central Park has long provided a refuge from the anxieties and stresses of daily life, perhaps never more so than during the coronavirus. New Yorkers who visited the park every day, as well as those who had long taken it for granted, felt a renewed love for this amazing rectangle of green in the heart of the big city. Its startlingly lush woodlands and rolling lawns, its meandering trails and wide open meadows, and of course, its astonishing wildlife, including owls." Let's see if I can bring the owl up. There we are. That's the very snowy owl, including owls, hawks, herons, and a dizzying array of other birds who for generations have used Central Park as a vital rest stop in their migratory travels, knowing what many humans only came to fully appreciate during the uncertainties of the pandemic, that the park is a beautiful and essential sanctuary, unquote. Just to give you a sense of the path that brought me to this film project, when I was young, I would visit the house of my maternal grandparents, very near Boston's Franklin Park. As an adult, I would regularly walk along Olmsted's Back Bay Fens and the Fenway to visit the Museum of Fine Arts and the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. I would jog around beautiful Jamaica Pond and botanize and stroll. And at this time of the year, when the conditions are right, cross-country ski and the Olmsted designed Harvard Arnold Arboretum. All those parks are integrated into Boston's famed Emerald Necklace, a crescent of Olmsted designed parks and parkways that wind around a major portion of the city. Of course, a little later, I would eventually visit Central Park and eventually come across Prospect Park in Brooklyn. The first time I entered through the Endale Arch, this arch, and looked into the expanse of the Long Meadow in Prospect Park, tears welled up as I was simply overwhelmed by its sheer beauty and utter perfection. And that was decades before the making of this little film was a glimmer in my eye. Well, perhaps some in the virtual audience today saw our original PBS film, Frederick Law Olmsted Designing America. Perhaps you caught the original PBS broadcast. Perhaps you managed to locate it on PBS website or watched it on one of the streaming platforms. But I learned very shortly after moving to Portland, Oregon some 27 years ago that the park system here was master planned by another Olmsted, the stepson John Charles. And about 14 years ago, after completion of a prior film project, I approached it by thinking about what would be next. I began to dive into the existing biographies that were out at that point in time about Olmsted Sr. and doing more background research. And I began to converse with scholars and landscape design professionals. And I approached an old friend back in Massachusetts who, his name is Laurence Cotton, and he's an associate of Ken Bird's, and I proposed a collaboration. And finally, after 7 years, our film did premiere on the PBS system in 2014. It also was featured at public screenings in several of the key Olmsted park cities of the East. And we did this, of course, with the support of WNED Buffalo. I have been fortunate, indeed, to present this film on an ongoing basis since that time, and you could say that is what brings me here today. But I do want to add that during the last 8 years, I've continued to dig even deeper into the Olmsted archives, to continue to meet with scholars and practitioners, and to explore additional Olmsted landscapes that I have never seen before. It's an ongoing process, and to revisit some of my favorite locations. So allow me to summarize some of the salient content of the film, to expand upon it, and to share some of my gleanings with you. Rather than reviewing Olmsted's entire career in this program, I simply want to launch him on his career trajectory and to hit at some of the stops along the curvilinear path, if you will, that caused him to become America's great park maker. His early years in brief. His life began in 1822 as the first son of a successful merchant, John Olmsted, in Hartford, Connecticut. As a youth, Olmsted roamed his native Connecticut landscape, initially, in fact, in the saddle, on horseback in his father's saddle, on rides through the New England countryside that left their mark. Young Frederick attended several boarding schools in Connecticut, but he had to abandon plans for college due to weak eyesight. He briefly worked for a New York City dry goods importing firm, but the young man was captured by romance of life at sea. In 1843, he set out for China as an apprentice seaman, and thus Fred Olmsted had set out for China as had his year before the mast, if you will, as a seaman sailing to China and back. In fact, it was a rather harrowing experience as you read it in the biographies. Olmsted did attend lectures at Yale, by the way, including one on the subject of scientific agriculture. His younger brother, John Hull Olmsted, did manage to matriculate at Yale, but not Fred. However, he did spend a great deal of time in the company of his brother and other Yaleys. Here is a photo of Olmsted with his brother and chums. I do want to point out, this is his brother. If you can see my cursor, this is John Hull Olmsted. Right below him with his head turned is we call him Flo, FLO, Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. And this fellow with his determined stare, eyes pointed right at us, is Charles Loring Brace, who became a prominent social reformer, and by the way, who had a fairly significant, profound influence on Olmsted's career and ideas. So he hung out with these other Yaleys. They were friends for his life. In 1846, Olmsted began to explore a career, in fact, as a scientific farmer, a field that was then on the rise. First, he apprenticed at a model farm near Syracuse, New York. Then, with his father's financial assistance, he first had a property briefly on the Connecticut shore. Subsequently, he buys this property, a larger property on Staten Island, Tussumuk Farm. He makes some improvements there. By the way, the bottom is his own sketch, Olmsted's sketch. The top is a early 20th century photograph of the site. It's there that he starts experimenting with, in this sub-arena of scientific agriculture, scientific farming. And he also experiments with drainage techniques, new drainage techniques that will come in handy in the early phase of building Central Park. This property, by the way, was recently placed on the historic register. I believe it's the State Historic Register in New York State. This is what it looked like, at least until a couple of years ago, but this group is raising funds to restore both the house and the landscape and to actually make it available as a historic park accessible to the public in the future. Not yet, we hope in the future. In 1850, Frederick travels to Europe and the British Isles in the company of his brother, John Hull Olmsted, and Charles Loring Brace. In 1850, Olmsted is hired by the New York Times to tour the South and file reports from the field. More about that in a minute. In 1855, Olmsted becomes partner in the firm that publishes the popular Putnam's Monthly magazine. That business fails in 1857, But that same year, Olmsted's first book about the South, A Journey in the Seaboard Slave States, is published. 1857 is a momentous year in Olmsted's life. He's appointed the first superintendent of Central Park. And it is after that that he and English-born architect Calvert Vaux collaborate on this, the winning design for the park called Greensward, quite famously. And with that success, Olmsted is appointed architect-in-chief. Here he is in that inimitable photograph as architect-in-chief for Central Park with his cape and his hat. In 1859, Frederick marries Mary Cleveland Perkins Olmsted, his brother's widow, and formally adopts her children, raising them as his own. In 1861, Olmsted is appointed General Secretary of the U.S. Sanitary Commission, a Civil War-era national medical relief outfit securing aid and supplies for the wounded soldiers. More about that also in a few minutes. After resigning his appointment with the Sanitary Commission, Olmsted is appointed Commissioner of the Yosemite and Mariposa mining estates. Here is the primitive town of Yosemite in the Sierra Nevada in 1860. He moves his entire family to the Sierra Nevada. Here they are gathered at a picnic on horseback in the Mariposa Grove. There's Frederick Sr. and Mary Olmsted here in the front foreground. And there, Olmsted manages a gold mine in a roughneck mining town that you just saw, and is appointed to a California State Commission that plays a leadership role in writing the first report proposing the permanent protection of Yosemite Valley. We have to give you at least one beautiful national parks picture in a program like this. I found this one recently. What a gorgeous shot of Yosemite Valley that is. More about that report in a little bit, by the way. In 1865, Olmsted is reappointed landscape architect for Central Park with Calvert Vaux on the left, and there is their design for Prospect Park. They begin work on that beautiful new park in Brooklyn. And on Broadway, in Manhattan, Olmsted and Vaux opened the first office of landscape architecture practice in the US, thus launches a unique career. Now, over the course of his life, Olmsted experienced considerable family tragedy. Early deaths of mother, brother, and children, his own near death in a terrible carriage accident in Central Park that left him maimed for life, and was plagued by a nearly lifelong struggle with dark depression and a host of other physical ailments. Toward the end of his life, fighting infirmities and utter exhaustion, he was still designing the landscape for the 1893 World Columbian Exposition in Chicago and the grounds of the Biltmore estate. Here it is circa 1900, and supervising the creation of these, his final masterpieces. Then he tragically lost his mind. After a few years of waning health and waning mental abilities, Olmsted passed away in 1903 at the McLean Asylum on the outskirts of Boston, an institution the very grounds of which he had designed. What a story, what a life. Now, let's review certain key aspects of that career, or perhaps we should say careers, his manifold roles of scientific farmer, social reformer, capable administrator, writer, editor, and literary publisher, landscape designer, and master park builder. Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. was first and foremost a social reformer, and his career was central to the social reform movement of the US during the second half of the 19th century. Olmsted was also a philosopher of democracy. He read widely and deeply and wrote thoughtfully about this subject and manifested it in his philosophy of park design and in his actual park creations. This is what Olmsted had to say about Central Park. And here is the sheep meadow in Central Park from the mid-COVID reopening of spring 2021 last year. This is Olmsted speaking. In Central Park, you will find all classes largely represented with a common purpose, each individual adding by his mere presence to the pleasure of all others, all helping to the greater happiness of each. You often see vast numbers of persons brought closely together, poor and rich, young and old. Frederick Law Olmsted. As one of our commentators, historian Keith Morgan, said, Olmsted intensely believed in democracy and in the park as a site for the enactment of democracy. Though he strayed away from describing himself as such, he was indeed an artist. As is stated by historian Sarah Cedar Miller, Central Park was arguably the most important piece of American art in the 19th century. Clearly, it was the most monumental in scale. And author and Olmsted expert Elizabeth Barlow Rogers had this to say about Central Park in our film, quote, "It is a triumph of 19th century engineering, a symphonic sequence of beautiful spaces." I love that phrase, a symphonic sequence of beautiful spaces. And this is how I like to capture it. I'm going to put this image up. Some of you will know this. Typically, it's referred to as the Oxbow. I believe the official title is After a Thunderstorm by Thomas Cole. There's the Oxbow in the Connecticut River. This is from the top of a low-rising mountain there called Mount Holyoke. I know this spot very well. I went to school literally and lived just a couple of miles from this site, and I know this landscape intimately. So while you consider this classic of Hudson River School painting, this is what I like to say. What the Hudson River School painters were doing with pigment and brush in 2 dimensions on canvas, Olmsted, early on in his collaboration with Calvert Vaux, was drawing, painting, and sculpting the landscapes of our great cities while working in 4 dimensions. What is the 4th dimension? I think most of you have figured it out. Time. In Olmsted's own words, quote, "I have all my life been considering distant effects and always sacrificing immediate success and applause to that of the future. In laying out Central Park, we determined to think of no results to be realized in less than 40 years, unquote." Now, you can read other comments and writings of Olmsted to realize, no, he didn't just think 40 years ahead. He had the Native American point of view. He actually thought hundreds of years into the future. Now, I don't have time today to do a deep dive into landscape design theory or landscape history, but let me simply say that as a landscape designer, Olmsted clearly was influenced by those who came before him, practitioners of garden design, the deep thinkers in the realm of art, including John Ruskin. But in particular, I want to mention the great English landscape designers, Capability Brown and Humphrey Repton. We also have to give a nod here in America to Andrew Jackson Downing, who was so influential in mid-19th century America before his premature death. I also want to offer this shorthand. Rather than explaining it to you in words, this is how I want to capture it. Regarding the incorporation of aspects of the pastoral and the picturesque in his masterworks. Let me just picture this. Let me allow you to picture this. Picture the contrast between the sheep meadow in Central Park and the ramble in Central Park. I'm going to go over that again. The sheep meadow and the ramble. There it is. That's your evidence for the pastoral and the picturesque. The same thing can be said, the same contrast between the long meadow and several of the wooded features in Prospect Park, and really in all of the Olmsted masterwork parks, including many of those carried out by his 2 sons. As builder of Central Park, Olmsted successfully managed thousands of men in one of the largest construction projects to that point in time in America. During the Civil War, as director of the U.S. Sanitary Commission, in essence, by the way, the forerunner to the Red Cross, Olmsted perfected his management skills while heading up a huge supply medical relief and field hospital outfit, including managing a veritable armada of hospital ships. Here is one depicted, a USSC hospital ship on the Mississippi. By the way, during that time, Olmsted reorganized the Army Medical Corps and coordinated contributions and volunteers from local aid societies. In fact, by the way, the U.S. Sanitary Commission was the largest national public health initiative up to that time in American history. Sanitary fairs, huge sanitary fairs, were held in the major cities of the North. Many of the leading women leaders of that generation of women leaders were involved with these sanitary fairs, organizing them, running them, raising funds, and in this case also Catherine Prescott Wormley working as a nurse in the field. And she and Frederick Law Olmsted worked closely together during that time. There's some good correspondence. And she wrote rather evocatively describing the man she worked with and for. In fact, Olmsted, by the way, was right there in the aftermath of a couple of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War, including Antietam and also at Gettysburg. Here is a U.S. Sanitary Commission hospital at Gettysburg in 1863. By the way, I would argue one of these days, I think someone's going to do a PhD thesis on this, but I would argue that through all these endeavors, Central Park, the Mariposa gold mining estate, and the U.S. Sanitary Commission, Olmsted was perfecting his own early version of management science, as he was extremely effective in organizing and directing large groups of people working toward a common goal. As to his early writings, a little bit about his writings. Olmsted published a travelogue and a reflective series of essays in the volume Walks and Talks of an American Farmer in England, the original publication on the left, a modern day version. You can buy this particular edition on the right. And it was at that point, particularly while exploring the English countryside, that Olmsted was working out what overarching landscape design concepts he thought best to apply to American soil, and by doing so to enhance the public park experience for everyone, not just the wealthy elite. In fact, Olmsted was particularly inspired by England's very first public park, Birkenhead Park, near Liverpool, England, designed by Joseph Paxton. In fact, he liberally borrowed many design elements that he really was keen on from Birkenhead and put them right into his greensward design that he co-produced with Calvert Vaux. On another front, the literary republic, Olmsted's 3 volumes about his journeys in the South and the plains throughout the slave states through frontier Texas had a lasting impact, and they're still in print. The later version of this was reissued as the Cotton Kingdom. You can still buy a version of this one with the introduction by Arthur Schlesinger Jr. Here is the very map he produced for the Cotton Kingdom. Olmsted's journalistic career started when he was hired by the early iteration of the New York Times as a roaming correspondent in what seemed to be a foreign land at that time, the antebellum South. And when the first book was published in England, it had a huge impact on intelligentsia, and there's good solid evidence that his writings about the slavery as they appeared in book form helped sway British public opinion away from supporting the Confederacy, where it was leading up to that point in time. And it was cited, the same writings about slavery were cited by none other than Charles Darwin as influential in his struggling with the concept of race as he was preparing The Origin of Species for publication. In addition to his stint as publisher and co-editor for Putnam's Monthly, Olmsted co-founded The Nation magazine. Let's see if I can give you a picture. Here it is. That's the original edition of The Nation magazine. Olmsted played a key role as editor of that publication in its very early years, the longest running, continuously published magazine of public opinion in America. Olmsted co-founded it. And during this relatively brief period in his career, Olmsted befriended and published some of the most prominent writers and intellects of the day. To name a few, you'll recognize these, I hope. I'm going to go start clockwise at the top left. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau. I hope some of you will recognize Herman Melville, lower right, and to his left, lower left, is Harriet Beecher Stowe. You could add many others, Washington Irving, Henry James, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, among others. Additionally, Olmsted had contact with several key painters of the Hudson River School, including notably a friendship with Frederick Edwin Church. Now, this is not Church. This is a very famous canvas of his about Niagara Falls. Well, I could go on. You get the point. Between Putnam's Monthly and The Nation, and through his social circle and ties to the cultural leadership, Olmsted's contacts were a veritable who's who of the arts and letters of America during this era. And to that list can be added many of the leading social reformers of the day, by the way. One note, we did try to give all due credit to Calvert Vaux in our film, for those of you who saw it, Olmsted's partner, the man who brought Olmsted into the actual design of Central Park, who subsequently convinced Olmsted to return to the business of park building once Prospect Park was in the offing. Poor Vaux, the sometimes neglected lesser-known partner, at least to the general public, but a great architect in his own right, yet a man that time seems to have passed over. It's important to understand the public park movement at this time in North America. In the highly polluted cities of the 19th century, trees, shrubs, and lawns and parks served as famously as the lungs of the city. Creating refuges of fresh air, park advocates argue, parks would provide refined imitations of nature, claiming that exposure to them would improve people's character regardless of their socioeconomic status. Architect and landscape designer Andrew Jackson Downing wrote this in 1848. This is Downing speaking. Quote, parks will be better preachers of temperance than temperance societies, better refiners of national manners than dancing schools, and better promoters of general good feeling than any lectures on the philosophy of happiness, unquote. Well, sentiments like that reflect the influence of the romantics of the New World's attitudes towards nature. What had once been seen as something separate from humans, to be conquered in fear, became something humans were a part of, that they could turn to for restoration. Downing and Olmsted brought their experiences of touring European gardens to the US, further emphasizing the beneficial relationship between humans and nature and democratizing the public park experience for everyone. Before Central Park, the principal place for urban New Yorkers to walk in nature were the paths of the Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn. You can still walk through it today. It is a very park-like, bucolic setting. By the way, the same thing would apply to famous Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge and some of the larger bucolic early generation cemeteries in particularly the Northeast of the US. I should emphasize here that parks were absolutely seen as instruments for public health. As in the mid-19th century, New York and all cities were still dealing with outbreaks of cholera and other diseases. In fact, Frederick Law and Mary Olmsted lost their first child due to cholera. Though the epidemiology of such diseases was imperfectly understood, indeed, Central Park served as the lungs of the city. In their argument supporting the design for Central Park, Olmsted and Vaux wrote this in 1868. Oops. Well, let's enjoy greensward while I share this extract. This is Olmsted and Vaux. Quote, "There is no doubt that the more intense intellectual activity, which prevails equally in the library, the workshop, and the counting room, makes tranquilizing recreation more essential to continued health and strength. Civilized men are growing more and more subject to the insidious enemies to their health and happiness, and against these the remedy cannot be found in medicine or in athletic recreations, but only in sunlight, in such forms of gentle exercise as are calculated to equalize the circulation and relieve the brain." Now, there's typically somewhat archaic language in these sorts of writings from that time period of time, but you may not entirely agree with their case for passive versus active recreation. Times have changed. But as you can see, in essence, they were early proponents of what could only be called forest bathing, a concept that in fact originated in Japan, much in vogue at this time. Henry David Thoreau certainly was a proponent of his own version of forest bathing. But I have to wonder, ladies and gentlemen, I have to wonder what Olmsted would think if he were here with us at this time, when he would see so many people wandering around the outdoors with soundtracks continuously beaming into their ears, or worse, not observing the natural world at all, but rather looking down with their eyes entranced by their shimmering screens. Now, we'd all like to think that this trio sitting on the park bench are solving the problems of the world, but you know as well as I do that they are entranced by their social media feeds and oblivious to the rest of the world. Okay, so much for that. Nothing personal against those three individuals. Now, our film zooms in on the stories of Central Park, Prospect Park, Buffalo, and Boston's Emerald Necklace. A few comments about those projects before I move on. Both Olmsted and Vaux considered Prospect Park their masterpiece. Let's give you Prospect Park. As they weren't hemmed in by a rectangular area at Prospect as they were at Central Park, they didn't encounter nearly the same level of political or fiscal interference. Plus, they didn't need to make as many compromises with their design. By the way, I have to show you this picture. As when I first entered Endale Park years ago, it was a dank, dark tunnel up above. And just in the last couple of years, it was fully restored to its original authentic bluting. Look at that picture down below. I think they did add some interior lighting into the inset lighting into the arched roof, but isn't that splendid? So how about Boston's Emerald Necklace, by the way? In fact, more specifically, the Back Bay Fens project. Here are two maps of the Back Bay Fens, the original Olmsted plan on the left, modern day map on the right. This places it in the larger context in the city of Boston. And by the way, this was a transformation of a tidal basin that was in essence part of the public sewers for the city of Boston, extending into the Charles River nearby. And this project can be pointed to as the first true wetland restoration project in America. I could talk about many of my delightful discoveries in the making of this film. In fact, one was Buffalo. Before beginning research on the film, I hadn't been to Buffalo since I was 6 years old. I had a vague memory of Niagara Falls. Arguably, the Olmsted Buffalo park system there is literally the best preserved and maintained in all of America. Note, it is a park system. Here is another glimpse of two Olmsted parks. It's Delaware Park on the left and Front Park on the right. Among the many extraordinary, beautiful parks in the Buffalo Olmsted park system, it's worth noting, in fact, these were part of the first truly integrated park system in America, designed as a system connected by parkways, invented at this very place and time by Olmsted and Vaux. The parkways, by the way, were often with segregated lanes for pedestrians, bicyclists, and here you see on the left, equestrian traffic. These were, in effect, linear parks that connected the principal parks of Buffalo, often incorporating traffic circles. And that's Lincoln Parkway on the left, historic image, and modern day Bidwell Parkway on the right in Buffalo. Also, the brilliant idea behind Olmsted's and Vaux's thinking here was that to think of the city as being contained within a giant park or system of parks or a park-like environment. Also of note, by the way, in Buffalo, there's been a good deal of acclaim recently to this very site, the recently restored Richardson Olmsted complex. Boy, has it received a lot of attention in upstate New York. This building complex with its landscape designed by Olmsted started out as the Buffalo Insane Asylum. And I should mention that this collaboration between landscape architect Olmsted and architect H.H. Richardson is one of many such extraordinary collaborations still manifest in New York State and in Massachusetts. Plus, you have the Niagara Falls State Reservation, designed by Olmsted and Box. A little background is in order here. In the 1860s, at Yosemite, Olmsted had advanced the theory that the Republic had the responsibility to protect scenic beauty. In the 1870s, Olmsted put theory into practice at the highly degraded industrial site that you see here at Niagara Falls. That is what it looked like. And the national campaign to preserve the waterfall complex was called the Free Niagara Movement, led by Olmsted. It amounted to the first big national campaign for scenic preservation and the first state park in the nation, Niagara Falls State Reservation in New York State. And I entirely agree with the commentary in the film. Here is the Olmsted box design for Goat Island, by the way. But I entirely agree with the commentary on the film. Sure, the falls themselves are powerful. They're beautiful, they're majestic, but go out to Goat Island above. Go out to Goat Island above the falls. Here's the Goat Island Bridge, designed by Box, on the rapids. Go out to Goat Island, and here is the bridge to the Three Sisters, the final leg of that beautiful landscape surrounded by rapids. It is a stunning, you're there with the mist rising and the roar of the falls below. It is a rich visual and oral experience. Now let's talk about John Charles Olmsted, also known as John C. Olmsted, sequentially nephew, stepson, and business partner of Frederick Law. The young man learned his father's acute skills of reading the land, understanding soils and vegetation types, and he acquired his father's artistic skills as a draftsman and as a landscape designer. He joined the stepfather's firm. Here he is at Fairstead in 1875 after graduating from Yale. Before his father's retirement, by the way, he worked on many projects, including the Back Bay Fens in Boston, you saw a minute ago, the Biltmore estate. And then as senior partner with the Olmsted brothers, he led many projects, including this one most famously, maybe. This is in Essex County, an entire county park system in Essex County in northern New Jersey. This is beautiful Branch Brook Park right in Newark with its gorgeous cherry trees flowering in the spring. John Charles worked on many other projects, by the way, also Atlanta, Louisville, Chicago. John C. Olmsted left a huge mark in the Pacific Northwest. I'm going to show you a little bit about my backyard for a couple of minutes here, across both urban and rural landscapes from Idaho to Victoria, British Columbia. John Charles Olmsted was invited out here by the cities of Portland, Spokane, and Seattle nearly simultaneously. And upon his first visits to the area, he saw sites like this. He was struck by the irregular terrain, the towering trees, the distant vistas across bodies of water. Here we're looking through the Douglas Fir to Puget Sound, from the mainland Washington, Puget Sound, the islands in the midground, and mountains in the distance. He was also captured not just by vistas like but vistas like this. Here is Mount Rainier from Seattle in the 1920s. You can barely make out Mount Rainier there. I hope you can see it. And I do want to point out how John C. Olmsted's appearance changed, interestingly enough, as he spent more and more time in the Pacific Northwest. Note the transition from the straight and narrow appearance in Boston to where he adopted something of a Sherlock Holmes look in the Pacific Northwest. Go figure. Isn't that an extraordinary transformation, folks? Funny thing, when I relocated from Boston to Portland, Oregon, the same thing happened to me 27 years ago. It just happens. You can't help it. Well, John C. Olmsted developed the master plans for the entire park systems in these three cities. In particular, he designed many of the parks and parkways in Seattle and Spokane, a little less so in Portland. But in my hometown, these past 27 years, Portland, Oregon, indeed, he did design, he started with this project, the 1905, let's bring it up, the 1905 Lewis and Clark Centennial Exposition grounds. He subsequently did the same thing in Seattle with the Alaska Yukon Pacific Exposition of 1909. Up there, they would refer to it as the AYP. Now, this is a pixelated art card, and it's an exaggerated perspective, but notice the foreground. You have, this is called the Court of Honor, and you have the fountain, and look at that looming Mount Rainier. Well, look at this next picture, because it became the centerpiece of the University of Washington, the UW campus. There it is. Here's that same, here's the Court of Honor, Drumheller Fountain, and more accurately, not so exaggerated, here is Mount Rainier to the southeast. So the AYP Exposition grounds became the centerpiece of the modern campus of UW. Now, John C. Olmsted would work on some 35 different projects for the Seattle park system, more than any other city in the region. Does that map look like another map I showed you a little while ago regarding Buffalo? Of course it does, same idea. John Charles park designs are still conspicuously evident in locations such as Volunteer Park, Green Lake Park, and the Washington Park Arboretum. Arguably, by the way, Volunteer Park, here it is today, remains the crown jewel. Some people would put it to you, the crown jewel of Olmsted Park designs in Seattle. There are certainly others that would maybe meet that stellar category. Now, if I were presenting this program for an audience in the Pacific Northwest, I would give you many additional examples in Portland and in Spokane. Can't take time for that today. But here is Laurelhurst Park, perhaps where I'm also speaking from virtually, but perhaps the most authentic Olmsted Park near where I live in Portland. Not designed, the system here was master planned by John C. Olmsted, but it was his anointed deputy, the first superintendent of Portland's parks, Emmanuel T. Mish, who actually individually designed those parks that we consider the Olmsted Parks of Portland, including famously Laurelhurst Park. Now, additionally, in the 1908 Portland Parks Plan, John C. Olmsted recommended that Portland protect a vast forest landscape on the flanks and summits of his West Hills. It's hard to get a good aerial of Forest Park, folks. It is one of the largest urban forest reserves in the United States. This gives you a sense of the perspective of how the Forest Park hovers over the Willamette River corridor. There's the industrial area to the immediate left. Downtown Portland is further up in the rear. That's downtown Portland. This is magnificent Forest Park. By the way, crisscrossed with trails. Here is a beautiful modern day bridge, the Maclay Trail going across Balch Creek, very popular trail. It's crisscrossed with trails, but also it's a very important wildlife corridor. And it still contains pockets of old growth Doug fir and other fir trees, other evergreens. Let's go further north for a minute. Now a well-established residential neighborhood. There's no place like the Uplands, folks, the Uplands in Victoria, BC. It's actually Oak Bay, a municipality just east of Victoria. It started out as lands owned by the Hudson Bay Company, interestingly enough. And Olmsted master planned every single home site and a beautiful greenscape there. This is the Olmsted master plan. And this is just one example of the streetscape with its antique street lighting. Before I return to Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., I do want to take a few minutes to talk about the City Beautiful movement in America and Jr.'s work on the World Columbia Exposition. The elder, first about the elder, I beg your pardon. The elder Olmsted, in working on the WCE, the Chicago World's Fair, he had further developed his ideas for planning comprehensive systems of parks, shaping the land to create spaces that seemed highly natural, but in fact have been highly designed to achieve a particular effect. He believed that cities could be improved through the application of the principles of landscape architecture. In a democracy, Olmsted argued, the health of the republic relied on the civic health of the voting population, and that public parks in and of themselves could enhance the civic strength of the community. Now, planning with a comprehensive view was a new idea in North American cities. Up until then, cities often grew in haphazard fashions. But in the 19th century, as it progressed, the idea of guiding city development to improve living conditions and promote economic development gained currency. What would become the City Beautiful movement had its roots in the World Columbian Exposition of 1893. And by the way, the Lake Park in Milwaukee is considered a City Beautiful era park. But the director of the World Columbia Exposition, Daniel Burnham, famous for this phrase, make no little plans, used the exposition to showcase how architecture, landscape design, and plan development could create the White City, a beautiful, orderly, functional space that contrasts sharply with the many chaotic and disorderly urban areas at that time. Now, I fully realize that the White City was a temporary stage set, a folly, and of course, a utopian fantasy, but it did set something significant in motion, including what would become known as the Macmillan Plan for Washington, D.C. Speaking of the Macmillan Plan, let's turn to Senior's namesake, his own son, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., often referred to as Rick, the younger brother who was brought into the family practice. He left a considerable mark across America, from Southern California to Florida, and to numerous sites in the nation's capital. Jr. was born on Staten Island, New York, the son of Frederick Law Olmsted and Mary Cleveland Perkins Olmsted, the widow of Olmsted's brother. And from his earliest years, Olmsted Jr. was aware of his father's fervent desire to have him carry on the family name and profession. And from early on, the father insisted that the son, Rick Olmsted, become far better educated in botany and horticulture, as the father felt inadequate in that arena. In the waning years of his life, the father included his son in the culminating projects of his own career. In fact, while still a student at Harvard, young Olmsted spent a summer working indeed in Daniel Burnham's office as the White City of the World Columbian Exposition arose in Chicago. And after graduating in 1894, Rick spent a year on site at Biltmore, the 100,000-acre estate being developed for George Vanderbilt in Asheville, North Carolina. Here are the gardens, a portion of the gardens at Biltmore. And following his father's formal retirement in 1897, Rick became a full partner with his half-brother, John Charles, in the family business. Here is that family business, folks. Highly recommend you go there. What a site. Fairstead, the Frederick Law Olmsted National Historic Site, a family home, the family business, and archives and exhibitry, and a place worth spending a day at if you're interested in this topic. Both sons, John Charles and Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., played key roles in founding the ASLA, the American Society of Landscape Architecture. Jr. also helped establish and taught at the first professional landscape architecture program in the nation at Harvard. Olmsted Jr. emerged on the national scene in 1901 when he was appointed to the Commission on Fine Arts for the District of Columbia, commonly known as the Macmillan Commission. Here is the Macmillan Plan, charged with interpreting for the 20th century Pierre Charles L'Enfant's vision of the nation's capital. Olmsted worked with his father's colleagues from the Chicago World's Fair to transform Washington into a work of civic art and to devise a comprehensive plan for its future development. A partial listing of Junior's projects in the nation's capital reads like a guide to Washington, D.C., including the National Mall, the Jefferson Memorial, Roosevelt Island, the National Cathedral grounds, the National Zoo, the White House grounds here indicated as the Executive Mansions, and Rock Creek Park, one of my favorite places to get away to when in D.C. And by the way, speaking of the nation's capital, I do want to remind you that Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. also left his mark there. Sr. did extensive landscaping work on the U.S. Capitol grounds, including reorienting the entrance and designing and seeing to the installation of the Capitol steps. Let's see if I can bring it up for you, folks. The Capitol steps. I just repeated it, the Capitol steps. Remember, Olmsted Sr. saw all his public commissions as public spaces where Americans would enact democracy. No further commentary necessary. On August 2015, the National Park Service hosted a special event commemorating the 150th anniversary of Olmsted's historic report, the Yosemite Valley and the Mariposa Grove of Big Trees. That report is largely credited with providing the basis for the creation of Yosemite National Park. The report's thoughtful wording is considered by many to be the first step in the establishment of our national park system. You might remember that the National Park Service celebrated its 100th anniversary in 2016, its centennial in 2016. In fact, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. played a key role in writing the language, the Organic Act of 1916, the founding legislation for the U.S. National Park Service. Like father, like son. For 30 years, Rick advised the National Park Service on issues of management and the conservation of scenic resources. He left a mark on the national parks from coast to coast, including Maine's Acadia National Park, the Florida Everglades, the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, and Yosemite. In fact, in his later years, he actively worked for the protection of California's coastal redwoods, by the way, and he lived to see Redwood National Park's Olmsted Grove dedicated in his honor. Let's swing back to the East Coast, take a quick look at some of the residential commissions there that are quite famous, starting with Senior's work in Riverside, Illinois. There's something of a specialty of the Olmsted fathers and sons, by the way. There was the early residential development designed by the father, Olmsted Sr., the village of Riverside, Illinois, established in 1869. It boasts of being one of the first planned communities in America, has several unique and defining features from that time, including curvilinear streets, ample setbacks, pastoral parkways with open lawns and naturalistic groupings of trees interspersed throughout the village. This is the equivalent of the Central Park for Riverside. Here's a meandering path, beautiful trees. I want to highlight just three of Junior's residential masterworks quickly, moving from north to south. Here's Forest Hills Gardens in Queens, Roland Park in Baltimore. And this one is kind of a beautiful spot. It's Mountain Lake, but here it's indicated as Mountain Lake States Historic District. It's in Lake Wales, Florida, immediately adjacent to Clock Tower Gardens in Lake Wales, the Junior's most celebrated botanical garden environment. What a beautiful site with its carillon. By the way, they're having an International Carillon Festival next month in March as part of their celebration of Olmsted 200. Both of these sites, if you're interested, well, Mountain Lake, unfortunately, is kind of a gated community, but this is a public park. It's a gorgeous botanical garden, and it's in Lake Wales in the Central Florida Highlands. Yes, there are highlands in Central Florida, about an hour south of Orlando. Now, I've already provided a glimpse into the Olmsted legacy in my region of the country, the Pacific Northwest. What about other Olmsted landscapes in the American West? And then we're going to come back to North Carolina, by the way. First, I want to take you to the Rocky Mountain states, in particular Colorado. The most significant site there is the Mountain Park System that can be found there in Denver. It comprises, I think, 16 or more properties that sprawl across 4 counties and 14,000 acres of land. The Olmsted brothers, under the leadership of Junior, they were hired in 1912 to master plan the entire Denver Mountain Park System, a regional park system and a series of connecting parkways that, no surprise, given that population, is hugely popular and heavily utilized to this day. The first and largest of these parks is Genesee Park. And by the way, Chief Hosa Lodge there on your left is still in the park. It's still utilized to this day. This is a black and white photograph. Off to the right, I believe that there's still a resident buffalo herd in Genesee Park. I'm going to be there in a month. I'm eager to see this park system. Perhaps you've heard of the Red Rock Amphitheater, famous for its concerts, big events in the outskirts of Denver. Well, the Red Rock Amphitheater is nestled into the rocky slopes of Red Rocks Park, part of the Denver Mountain Park System master plan by Olmsted Jr. Additionally, beyond Denver, starting in 1907, the Olmsted brothers were contracted by the Boulder City Improvement Association to produce some city plans. Here it is. Plans that continue to guide the development and the growth of the burgeoning city of Boulder, Colorado. Here's some images for you with the mountains in the background, the foothills to the Rockies, and here is downtown Boulder today. What about California, folks? There's a lot in California. Again, a whole program could be devoted to Olmsted in California, as it could be for the Pacific Northwest, but a brief listing would include 2 principal senior commissions in California: Mountain View Cemetery in Oakland, the equivalent of Mount Auburn Cemetery or Greenwood in Brooklyn for the San Francisco Bay Area. Here's an early image. Here are 2 contemporary images of beautiful Mountain View Cemetery, which is treated like a public park. Also, the campus design for Stanford University. Client Leland Stanford often overruled architect Olmsted, yet the result of their collaborative and at times tense partnership produced a campus master plan of considerable ambition and architectural brilliance. The Olmsted Stanford design is distinctive for its monumental scale and the use of sightlines that extend throughout the campus. There's an aerial view of Stanford. Later in the 20th century, in the hills and valleys to the north, south, and east of the cities of Berkeley and Oakland, here are the Berkeley Hills, the Olmsted brothers master planned an extensive system of beautiful, large, semi-wild parks. Here is the first, the most famous, the historic Charles Lee Tilden Regional Park. And there are others here, but to Franklin Ridge, that's the East Bay Regional Park District. And here is Redwood Park on the East Bay, by the way. And this regional park system is a sprawling system that now includes a portfolio of some 65 parks. Speaking of park systems, in 1928, the California State Park Commission hired Olmsted Jr. to conduct a survey identifying lands for the state park system. The final survey identified 125 potential parks. In the process, Olmsted created a master plan for saving the remaining 5% of California's majestic redwoods. Here is the redwoods in the Santa Cruz Mountains, state lands, and the vast lands of the Anza Borrego Desert. Here it is in bloom, and many other important landscapes that Olmsted added to this portfolio of California state park lands. In 1913, a group of investors, going further south, Southern Cal, 1913, a group of investors purchased 25,000 acres in the Palos Verdes Peninsula, hired the Olmsted brothers to develop the expansive coastal landscape. Here is the real estate map for Palos Verdes estates. Palos Verdes was one of the Olmsted brothers' largest and most complex projects with input from scientists, engineers, and horticulturalists. It was required to transform the site from a rugged, hilly lime shale terrain to 16,000 acres suitable for a complete community, including, of course, residential areas, a commercial center, and extensive parkland, all with sweeping views and vistas to the Rocky Coast and the Pacific Ocean. There's Palos Verdes today. Still in Southern Cal, the Los Angeles basin. In 1930, remember I quoted that article at the beginning of this from the LA Times. In 1930, two of America's most prominent landscaping planning firms, the Olmsted Brothers and Bartholomew Associates, submitted a report to the Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce that would have radically changed the city as we know it today. Here is their map from that plan in 1930. The report was, it would have radically transformed LA if it had been acted upon, but it was met with great enthusiasm publicly, but it was buried and never acted upon for political and economic reasons. A few years ago, my eyes were opened up in a visit to LA when I toured LA with a wonderful organization called Amigos de los Rios. And I was so impressed with their staff and volunteers working with scientists and professional planners and landscape designers. They're trying to bring the Olmsted Bartholomew plan into the 21st century by regreening LA and the Los Angeles basin from forest to ocean, and thereby creating a new emerald necklace in Southern California and metropolitan LA. Now, before I wrap this up, I know some of you in the Forest History Society audience today have been scratching their heads, saying I missed something important about Olmsted and forestry. Well, first off, on the more general topic on Olmsted and horticulture, that's the subject of an entire separate program, as is the subject of Olmsted and forests, or maybe more specifically, Olmsted and trees. And I was not invited here to deliver a talk on Olmsted and forestry. Plus, I know there are folks on the other side of this Zoom, including staff such as James Lewis at the Forest History Society, who know more about this topic than I do. But however, let's spend a few minutes talking about Biltmore, Gifford Pinchot, Carl Schenck, the Biltmore Forest, and the cradle of forestry. Here's a short version of that story. If I can bring up George Vanderbilt Jr., he decided to create his own kind of a private paradise in the country near Asheville. The Biltmore estate was built over the course of 6 years from 1889 to 1895. In addition to the lavish house, the largest private home ever built in America, the estate would include 125,000 acres of grounds. Vanderbilt hired none other than Frederick Law Olmsted to make improvements to that vast property. The grounds that Olmsted designed included a small pleasure grounds and garden. Here is the garden under construction, a major arboretum and a nursery, and a systematically managed forest. Olmsted hoped that creating a managed forest would serve as an example for the rest of the country. The land purchased for Biltmore had previously been cleared for farming and timber. Olmsted prepared instructions and trained foremen to improve the existing woodland by removing poorly formed and damaged trees and reforesting eroded and degraded, if not to say depleted, farmland. And here are those sections of landscape on the now beautiful Biltmore property in their terrible degraded state when Olmsted was first making improvements. In 1891, by 1891, he had planted 300 acres with white pine. And as Olmsted executed his forestry improvements, he documented his work in one of the earliest known forest management plans. The title of this was Project of Operations for Improving the Forest of Biltmore. Here is a view of that mature landscape from the Biltmore house today. In 1892, Olmsted hired the young, professionally trained forester Gifford Pinchot, who would eventually, as you all know, go on to become the first chief of the U.S. Forest Service. Pinchot implemented a management plan that improved the forest while returning a profit to the landowner. The first of its kind in America. Here is a before and after in the Biltmore woods, the mature white pine forest on the right. After Pinchot left the estate for Washington, D.C. to head up the Division of Forestry, German forester Carl Schenck took charge of the forest, which in 1895 totaled more than 100,000 acres. Shortly after Schenck arrived, he established the Biltmore Forest School, the first of its kind in America. Here they are, students and professor on horseback at the Forest School. And during its 15 years of existence, the school educated more than 300 students. Let's see if I can give you a picture of the students in the field doing their work in the forest. They would go on this 300 to become the first generation of American foresters. In 1914, Edith Vanderbilt sold approximately 86,700 acres of the estate's forested mountain land known as Pisgah Forest to the federal government, creating the Pisgah National Forest. Today, as I understand it, the remaining forest at the Biltmore estate continues to be managed with the guiding principles set by Olmsted, Pinchot, and Schenck. In 1968, 6,500 acres of Pisgah were designated as the cradle of forestry in America, and I expect many in the audience today have been here to this site to visit the historic site of the Biltmore Forest School to explore the historic buildings and grounds, where Carl Schenck educated and mentored so many young foresters. And I would like to think that 100% of our audience today have had the opportunity to explore the expansive grounds of the Biltmore estate, where thanks to Frederick Law Olmsted and George Vanderbilt, Gifford Pinchot launched his career, and where the field of scientific forestry got its start in America at this very site, the Biltmore Forest School, the cradle of forestry. And here is the cradle of forestry overlook in the Pisgah National Forest. Well, I want to just briefly mention one more topic, since the Forest History Society and its offices and library are housed at Duke University. And Duke is one of the many East Coast campuses master planned by Olmsted Sr. and the Olmsted Brothers firm across America, countless academic campuses. Endowed in 1924, Duke promised to be a beautiful, elite Southern university that would rival colleges in the Northeast. Desiring a beautiful campus, Duke's founders turned to the Olmsted Brothers for a campus plan. The firm was responsible for the roads, quads, and pedestrian paths on the Durham, North Carolina campus. The Olmsted firm worked with architect Harry Trumbauer to determine the placement and location of campus buildings. And at Duke University, the Olmsted brothers were responsible for grading the land, establishing patterns of canopy trees, designing and planting quads, as well as the paths and roadways for the rest of the campus. And characteristically, here is their extensive plant list for the Duke University campus, coming out of the Olmsted office. And part of their axial design would become Campus Drive, a forested thoroughfare serving as the spine of the campus, centering everything together. And the design of the Olmsted brothers is still manifest today, with the campus retaining a park-like setting. Not only a park-like setting there on campus, but also not too far away, 6,000 acres of the forest, the Duke Forest. Here's one image of the forest overall, and I love this fall image of a trail in the Duke Forest in autumn. Beautiful. I'm bringing this program to a close, folks, with a few additional comments. During the past couple of years of COVID quarantine and social distancing, public parks have been a lifesaver for so many of us, seeking fresh air, exercise, physical and psychological health, and doing so safely. Frederick Law Olmsted now appears so entirely prescient. As for one, he emphasized public health, mental health, and taking it even further, the spiritual health benefits of the park experience, that is for everyone in a democracy. Though Olmsted did not utilize current terms so common in our vocabulary today in the parks world, terms such as equity and access. However, if one reads his writings, you could argue that he cared deeply about all those issues. So as we commemorate Olmsted's senior's birthday this spring and this entire year, and the Olmsted landscape design legacy, again, during all of 2022, we also highlight the ever more crucial role that the public park experience plays in our lives. Needless to say, COVID and social and environmental justice movements have only greatly underlined that very fact, and the urgent need to provide more green space and to distribute it equitably and make all such spaces accessible and inviting to all. In fact, it isn't too much of a stretch to say that that was Frederick Law Olmsted's agenda from the very start. I do pray for all of our sakes that within a year, if not before then, we will have this pandemic entirely behind us in our rearview mirrors. Then we will feel more comfortable traveling freely about this beautiful land. I urge you to revisit cities that you've not been to in a long time, or perhaps see parts of America you have never seen before, including cities that have been in the news for not such positive reasons, maybe some of our so-called Rust Belt cities. I urge you to visit Louisville, see Cherokee Park in Louisville, see Lake Park in Milwaukee. Here's a ravine trail in Lake Park in Milwaukee. Go to Belle Isle in Detroit. When Boston, don't just visit the Emerald Necklace, but you might also visit one of my very favorite places in all of New England, the World's End Reservation in Hingham, Massachusetts, designed by Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. Also, if you go to Buffalo, yes, visit the Buffalo Parks by all means, absolutely, but go out to Goat Island. Look at Niagara Falls from Goat Island and see Niagara Falls with fresh eyes. I want to leave you with these thoughts finally. Perhaps we'll let Daniel Burnham, Here's an image of Olmsted and landscape design. I kind of like this one. Perhaps we'll let Daniel Burnham, the driving force for the World's Columbian Exposition, close out this program. And when the World's Fair was set to open in 1893 at a dinner with all the artists and architects gathered to laud Burnham for his achievements, Burnham himself pivoted and said this about his collaborator Olmsted while we enjoy this famous canvas of Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. prominently hung on the walls inside the Biltmore estate. This is Burnham speaking. Each of you knows the name and genius of him who stands first in the heart and confidence of American artists, the creator of your own parks, Frederick Law Olmsted, an artist. He paints with lakes and wooded slopes, with lawns and banks and forest-covered hills, with mountainsides and ocean views. He should stand where I do tonight, not for the deeds of later years alone, but for what his brain hath wrought and his pen has taught for half a century. Unquote. Daniel Burnham about Olmsted. Finally, in Olmsted's own words, the beauty of the park should be in the beauty of the fields, the meadow, the prairie, of the green pastures and still waters. What we want to gain is tranquility and rest to the mind. Is it doubtful that it does men good to come together this way, in pure air and under the light of heaven? Frederick Law Olmsted. Seems to me that that prescription, if you will, rings as loud today in 2021 as 2022 as it did in the late 19th century. Thank you, Frederick Law Olmsted and Sons. Thanks to all of you for your time and attention today. It's been a pleasure to join you with the Forest Historical Society today. I'm going to quickly run by some books. I'm going to recommend some books for you, quickly run them down. If you have any interest to further explore, Clearing in the Distance by Witold Brzezinski, still a classic as far as I'm concerned. Genius of Place by Justin Martin. Absolute classic by the reigning dean of Olmsted Scholarship in America, Charles Beveridge, Frederick Law Olmsted, Designing the American Landscape, just republished. New coffee table book, republished. But by the way, it's not just beautiful pictures, it's also an exquisite text, highly recommended. Also, there's some new books out there. Here's the first ever biography of Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., just came out in the fall. Beauty, Efficiency, and Economy by Elizabeth Hope Cushing. Also just released in the fall, The Power, this is one that might interest many of you, The Power of Scenery, Frederick Law Olmsted and the Origin of National Parks by Dennis Drabell. Also, if you're interested at all in the collaboration between H.H. Richardson and Olmsted, this was literally published 2 weeks ago, Architects of an American Landscape. And by the way, I know at least 3, if not 4 additional books that are due out starting next month in March and all the way through this calendar year. Many new books coming out, timed with Olmsted 200. For those of you who haven't want to connect with Olmsted 200, here's your, take a screenshot, here's all your social media, here's the website. For those of you who haven't seen our film, take a screenshot of this because you cannot find it by randomly searching for it on PBS. You will only go to a site where you can view the film, but if you go to this URL, not only can you view the film, there's a great deal of supplementary video material, and I think 7 essays, scholarly essays, written about Olmsted, his design philosophy, and his legacy, and that of his, at least one of his sons as well. It's all up there on our website, for the dedicated website for the film. And these are just some of my sources and resources that I also recommend to you. I won't spell them out. You can take a screenshot. And this is how you stay in touch with me if I can get to that slide. Oops, well, we just closed out. That's fine. Thank you, everyone. It's been a pleasure. On to a conversation, on to Q&A. Thank you.
So to follow up on that link to the film, that'll be available to you in the follow-up email you'll receive tomorrow. Whether you attended or not, but of course, if you didn't attend today, you wouldn't hear me saying this, but it'll be in the follow-up email. So, and Laurence is right. I'll characterize it a little differently, which is for those who teach, it's a wonderful, wonderful repository of educational materials there. So in addition to the hour-long film, there's some other clips that, and also, as he said, essays and stuff. So that link will be available to you. Laurence, I'm going to put you on the spot and say, if you send me those links that were in that one site, we'll provide those as well. The other plug I'll offer up is with those books and other scholarship on Olmsted, if you come to our website, foresthistory.org, under research, we have a bibliographic database. And so many, if not all of these publications will be listed. You'd be able to just do a keyword search on Frederick Law Olmsted, and you'll find all, like I said, just about all of those. We don't have that new one, a book that's coming out, and you said it'll be out right in 2 weeks, or it came out 2 weeks ago. We'll get that one in there shortly. So we'll provide all that material. Laurence, thank you so much for that. We've got some really great questions, and we're going to kind of move chronologically through them. John Patrick Mullins asks, would you elaborate on the importance of Olmsted's journeys through antebellum South for his intellectual development? What do you see as the connection between his observations about slavery and slave society in the 1850s and his future work on urban parks and national parks? And Dr. Mullins is at Marquette University in Milwaukee.
And I know Dr. Mullins quite well. Thank you for the question. I just answered this question the other day in this way. It's not so much about slavery, although he did draw the distinction between free capital versus obviously slave capital. The difference between the capitalist system of the North, which didn't rely on slavery, versus the economy of the South, which was so intrinsically bound up with slavery. And he drew a lot of lessons for that, of course. But the part that relates most to, frankly, landscape architecture and parks is this. The South was notably lacking in amenities. It had very few public libraries. It had no public parks. Sure, it had a town square, but the lack of public amenities he kept remarking on it was striking. There just was, there wasn't this sense of civic community that comes out of having public amenities such as libraries, parks, gathering places, both outdoors and indoors, for people to come together in common weal, if you will. That wealth was concentrated in such a small group in the South. Yes, sure, there were already the early version of, if you will, robber barons up north, but wealth was still far more distributed up north than it was in the South. So wealth was so highly concentrated in the South, and there was just a extraordinary lack of public amenities. And he saw that as the great, he found some of the communities charming, he found some of the people charming, despite other concerns, needless to say, about slavery and so forth, and those who carried the lash, so to speak. But it was the lack of public amenities. And that's part of what drove him to create not just public parks, but park systems and parkways. And that he saw parks literally as a way to strengthen democracy. Not just for the North, but as a way to bring the whole nation together after the conclusion of the Civil War. And notice he did, by the way, I didn't get into all of it. There's many more Olmsted parks in the South. Not quite as many as there are in the North or the upper Midwest, but there are many Olmsted parks in the South, from North Carolina, Georgia, Florida. By the way, I'm going to Birmingham. There's an extensive, now it's not Olmsted Sr., it's the Olmsted brothers. But I'll be in Birmingham in just 2 days' time. There's an extensive park system in Birmingham. And Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. intentionally was building those parks to reach Black neighborhoods at that time. I discovered in my research in the early 20th century in Birmingham. Think about that. And he was following in his father's footsteps. They were progressive, they were free, they were wide, very open-minded progressives during their time period, and very prescient in so many things. So that's the takeaway lesson. By the way, speaking of forthcoming books, and I should have the exact title to cite to you, but there's another new book I haven't yet shared with you. That's the one that's coming out in March. Rolf Diamond is one of the co-authors. You probably know Rolf, Jamie. And the book is Yosemite, the Civil War, and National Parks, and Olmsted. How all three of those experiences came together to make, it addresses Patrick's question, to to engender this extraordinary genius who went forth based on all those experiences to become the founder of the modern field of landscape architecture and the master park builder in America. So look out for that book coming up in March.
All right, I'll put a link. So a few years ago, Rolf gave a lecture here on that topic. Now, Olmsted was in the background, but the connection between the Civil War and the national park movement, he gave that talk. I'll put that link in the description below. It's a wonderful presentation. And then he kind of summarized that in an article for our magazine, Forest History Today.
And it's now been fully developed as an entire book, which is coming out in, I think, in about a month.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
I didn't know about that.
Yeah.
Kind of staying in the South and in that time period, Chuck Pills asks if you've read the book by Tommy Horowitz, or maybe it's Tony Horowitz. Anyway, the book is entitled Spying on the South.
Yeah.
And he retraces Olmsted's trip through the South. And so have you read it, and do you have any reaction or comment?
Yes, and I almost included a picture of it. I'm hesitant to, because first of all, I met Tony. He was a great guy. I have to say the late Tony Horowitz, who died suddenly a couple of years ago. It's a great book. It's a fun read. It's tongue-in-cheek. It's rather snide in his attitudes. He writes it kind of as a Northern intellectual, to be honest. Mm-hmm. His prior book was Confederates in the Attic. So it doesn't take too much to extrapolate upon that kind of point of view. I don't know how well it's been received in the South. I'm actually going to be asking people in Birmingham if they've read it and what they thought of it. It is a travelogue. It is a humorous travelogue and a recreation of Olmsted's travels through the South, reflected through the present day divisions in America, that prism. And it's a good read. I don't consider it a scholarly text, but it's a good read. However, it does bring to mind another recommendation. There is for everyone to keep eyes and ears out for. There is she's been making the rounds in America during this Olmsted 200 year. Her name is Sarah Zawde. It's spelled Zewde, a Harvard Graduate School of Design trained landscape architect who was African-American with her own practice in Harlem. She has retraced Olmsted's Cotton Kingdom, has done her own extensive research and lecturing on this topic. And I believe later this year or in 2023, she's publishing a book called The Cotton Kingdom Revisited, and it'll be through the eyes of an African-American landscape architect, which I think is going to be quite fascinating. You can look up her lectures that she's delivered around the country, and is continuing. She's delivering one here in Portland virtually in 1 week's time, actually.
Okay.
Yep.
So now you didn't mention this in your talk, so I'll give a quick touch of background here. In the 1890s, there was a very influential magazine called Garden and Forest. And there's also a book on its impact. And so we have an anonymous question asking if Olmsted had any involvement or any influence on the magazine. And then, well, I'll let you answer that, and then there's a follow-up.
I have to say I am familiar with the publication, but I'm not intimately familiar with it. And I've seen copies of both the covers and I've seen some articles that appeared in it. And I believe Olmsted contributed on a couple of occasions. Other than that, I have no information that tells me he was involved in an editorial capacity in any way. I believe he was just an occasional contributor, but I'm not terribly well informed on Olmsted's history with that publication.
Okay.
Yeah.
And this person is suggesting that Olmsted was only the tip of the iceberg, meaning there's a large and diverse group of planners, conservationists, architects, and social reformers. But more to the point, asking, have we lost that legacy? And I'll let you interpret that however you wish.
Very good question. Perhaps to an extent. And unquestionably, particularly at a time like this, Olmsted is, paramount because he's on everyone's mind and on everyone's lips. And even he overtowered Calvert Vaux, and many people forgot about Vaux and their very key collaborations. Many people forgot about H.H. Richardson and his key collaborations with Olmsted, but thanks to a new book, that's been reinterpreted for the modern era. And yes, I mean, there are many horticulturalists, Charles Sprague Sargent. There's also Warren Manning, who was a wonderful systematic thinker about topography and natural systems, who started his career with the Olmsteds and then who moved on and became independent. And by the way, who was so influential in Birmingham, as I recently discovered. Now he's he's a landscape practitioner and an urban planner. There are people like Jens Jensen, who was so instrumental with his prairie style of park planning in the Midwest, particularly Chicago and the outskirts of Chicago in that general area. And he's well known up there, well respected up there. And certainly people in the field of landscape architecture know Jens Jensen. But no doubt, this is what happens. I'm here today and most of this year to speak about the Olmsted legacy. But yes, that's the role of the anonymous writer and the role of institutions in the field of horticulture and botany and forestry and landscape architecture to make sure that all of these people, male and female, and there were many female, including Beatrix Farrand, we cannot forget Beatrix Farrand, who were so significant in their contributions to these fields. So because of Olmsted's, he was a Renaissance man. He had many careers. He wrote voluminously. He knew everyone. And so he comes to the top. But there are many others, and we need to pay attention to all these.
Okay. Charles McClure asks, can you elaborate on the design puzzles that still exist today of the tensions for the park margins, the view for those inside the park to block out developments outside the park, and those living adjacent to the park wanting to see into the park?
Fascinating question. I haven't given that much thought. I suppose the questioner is thinking of places like Central Park, for instance, which has either walls or dense plantings or berms, more often planted berms, which do prevent a view from the outside looking in, but they certainly do help keep that park feel like a more pristine environment, and they do to a certain extent block out the noise of traffic to a certain extent. Those who are in high enough buildings, and there are many, if you're in Central Park, certainly have views from their atmospheric perches that they've paid a mint for to have a good look at Central Park, but not the average person at ground level from outside looking in. And certainly there are other parks like that. And that is a tension. And it's an interesting tension in urban environments. And to be honest, I haven't thought much about it. I can certainly see that it's an issue, would be an issue both with historic preservation with regards to the Olmsted parks, but also an issue in contemporary landscape design practice. It seems to me that modern, and I've been to many of the modern, I see, believe me, I'm not just focused on the historic parks. I mean, I love the High Line. I've been to Governor's Island in New York. I love Brooklyn Bridge Park, love it. And I've been to well, I could talk about this if you prompted with a question, what I think are the modern Olmsted parks of the 21st century. And I would tell you Floyd's Fork. Floyd's Fork and the outskirts, the southern outskirts of Louisville. Floyd's Fork is an extraordinary contemporary linear park system, just astounding. I think it's a near masterpiece of its own. And sure, there are winding roadways, but at the same time, it feels quite open. Now, that's not an urban park either. It's at the rural interface. But there are ways that contemporary urban parks, landscape architects, I'll use Brooklyn Bridge Park as an example, where yes, there are some use of berms, really just to make it a more interesting visual environment, but it's entirely open from the outside. There are ways for people in the surrounding areas, particularly if you're in Brooklyn Heights, but even at the ground level, to have a good feel for the fact that you're next to this gorgeous urban park. But it's an important issue that this individual raised. Remember, I'm not a practicing landscape architects. So I just talked about it as a observer, a generalist observer from the outside, not as a practitioner.
I think you actually presented you had two photos that you showed back to back. One was of the Shoots Field in Central Park. At a distance, you can see the skyline of New York.
Mhm.
And then the next one was taken within the park, the ramble. And I think that just visually, that captures that tension right there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Go ahead. So Jacqueline Swope asks, and this is there a place, meaning a website, that lists all the parks and locations of the Olmsted projects?
Yes.
What's that URL, if you know it off the top of your head?
No, but I would say go to two sites. Go to the National Association for Olmsted Parks, NAOP.org. There are extensive resources there, or directly to Olmsted Online, which is actually managed by the NAOP. So it's NAOP.org or olmstedonline.org. That would be one resource. The other one would be the Frederick Law Olmsted National Historic Park in Brookline, Massachusetts. All of that information would be on both, I believe, all of their works would be listed. If you drill down far enough, you would find all those works, their works listed on both those sites.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Michael asks, where to go? 150 years out from the time he was working, really, with Central Park and in that era. 150 years of hindsight, is there anything you can pinpoint that Olmsted got wrong? And Michael is a forest ecologist who, when you were showing those photos of the cut over forest and then the white pine plantation, he had a reaction, which is he'd rather see a mixed, diverse forest than the single species plantation. So that's his background. Anything that comes to mind for you that you're like, maybe that not so good?
Well, I'm not a forester. I know there are many people in the forest arena as a part of this Zoom call today, but I would totally concur with that. I would also rather see a mixed forest in that incidence, not a white pine plantation, really, was what it was. Remember, it was, they wanted to extract, Vanderbilt did want to extract some income from managing that forest as well. Yes, I will say, and even the two sons made some corrections. My research tells me that the two sons, not only were they far better trained in botany and horticulture than was the father, and particularly Junior, but they also were more sensitive to the local natural ecology than the father. The father was to a certain extent. The father certainly knew about drainage. He pays a lot of attention to drainage and soil conditions. And it's a long story. There would be a sidebar about this, but it pertains to the history of Golden Gate Park in San Francisco. But he was sensitive to the local landscape and the local climate. And that actually did play out when he worked in more arid environments, both the father, but the sons very much more so. They were very sensitive to the natural climate conditions and the natural soil conditions and native plants. Olmsted, especially early on, he brought in many non-native trees, as probably all of you know, in places like Central Park and Prospect Park. They're filled with a ton of non-natives, some of which have stood the test of time, some of which haven't. But I think the two sons were more sensitive to not bringing in quite so much exotic vegetation and relying on plantings of native vegetation, not exclusively, but more so. And certainly that would be one of the lessons for the modern era. And all 21st century landscape architects pay attention to that. They have for decades, even from mid-20th century onwards, native vegetation, being sensitive to the native ecology. That would be one issue where I would, if I were a successor in the Olmsted firm, that I would be paying attention to.
Yeah, and it makes sense because he's drawing on the English precedents. And as I understand it, they had no qualms, but they also had no scientific understanding of the impact of non-native species.
And needless to say, we have the impact of climate change now, which really, obviously, even in the early mid-20th century, neither of the two sons were paying all that much attention to. So that would be another whole factor for at this point in the 21st century.
Jonathan Putnam asks if there are any parks outside of the United States. And I'm going to throw Canada in there too, because of course the Olmsteds, plural, designed some parks in Canada. Any parks outside North America, really, influenced directly by Olmsted that you can think of?
Yes. I don't know much about it, but there's a park in Panama City. Jr., I'm quite sure it's Frederick Olmsted Jr. There's a park in Panama City, and of all things, there's a country club in Caracas, Venezuela. There are those two Olmsted Park sites, or landscape sites more broadly. Country club isn't necessarily a public park, but there are those two sites in Central and South America that I'm aware of beyond Canada. And by the way, Canada is from Victoria, BC to Calgary to Winnipeg to Montreal. It's actually 4 distinct locations across Canada. The most famous of which, of course, is Mount Royal Park in Montreal. But
and dealing with very, very different climates.
Sure.
Yeah, that's remarkable.
Yeah.
Mary Hollinshead asks, for the Central Park project, Olmsted clearly brought logistical and practical experience. Did Vaux bring more experience with design and its use in the English tradition? I guess maybe she's kind of wanting to know a little bit more about Vaux and his influences.
Well, again, Vaux also de facto became a landscape architect, but his training was as a structural architect. And he was the one who designed, both in the greensward design and in the actual creation of these parks. You know, there are many structures. Some of them are gone, but there was a dairy in Central Park. Back then, they had dairies for the children to make sure the children received their milk. Anyway, there were many structures in Central Park, some of which are still there today, some of which are gone. I mean, also in Prospect Park, also in Franklin Park, and Boston's Emerald Necklace. Well, although Vaux wasn't there involved with the Emerald Necklace, but in the Buffalo Park system, which Vaux was involved with. So he would work on all the structural elements, including, by the way, the traffic circles, the walls, the rock, the use of rocky material in the building of the bridges and the berms and the overpasses and the underpasses and all of those structures, not just buildings, but other kinds of structural elements. That was Vaux's expertise, that he contributed to all, Goat Island, that he contributed to all of these projects, in addition to kind of an overall design consciousness with the two of them working as partners, but that was his particular contribution. And it did come to some extent from the English tradition, but he also Americanized. I mean, after all, he did the original building for the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He did the original building for the Museum of Natural History in New York City, adjacent to Central Park. The original building is Vaux. He was a major player for a period of time, producing some extraordinary structures. And they did have European elements, no question, but he also, over time, I think, developed a little bit of an American consciousness in this respect, working with Olmsted.
Well, speaking of Europeans and European influences, we're going to finish with a question from Nicholas Corker, who's the innovation manager at the United Kingdom Center for Ecology and Hydrology. So thank you, Nicholas, for tuning in from across the pond, as they say.
Yeah.
And he asks, what can we learn from the early forest and landscape schools that we might still apply here a century plus later?
I don't know. I'd be curious for someone like yourself, Jamie, to answer that from the point of view of the forestry school arena, which you know more about. Well,
he did. I kind of didn't help you there, Lawrence. Okay. So he started out as saying, has landscape or public land management education lost its way today? Okay. In that regard, I don't know what he's getting at.
Right.
But
well, I think what he might be getting at is the art history origins, the aesthetic origins, the art history, the John Ruskin, the Capability Brown, the Humphrey Repton, the influence of the Romantics in literature and the Transcendentalists. And by the way, Olmsted was profoundly influenced by both Transcendental thought, in particular Ralph Waldo Emerson, and he was profoundly influenced by the Hudson River School. They were part of his mindset as he launched forth his park designing career, his landscape design career. So that's a certain period of time. Now, contemporary architects, contemporary landscape designers have to be trained in contemporary techniques and methods and materials and modern day CAD/CAM, modern day technology that is instrumental in the work that they do in their design effort. But yes, perhaps there's some element, I don't know, I can't say I haven't been through a professional landscape architecture program as a student. I am not credentialed as such, but I think at places like Harvard, they probably still do to a certain extent hark back to some of these traditions, but they're probably elective courses and not required courses in these mostly master's programs. And perhaps there is a certain element missing in the US. I can't speak to the UK of that, the artistic origins of the profession, the aesthetic origins of the profession, its progenitors. And maybe that, I expect that's what the questioner is getting at. And that kind of the larger Renaissance man kind of view as to how this profession got going. It's not just a technical profession. It's an artistic profession. I think that's what he's probably getting at.
Yeah, I would expect them, a student, whether it's a semester-long course or an introductory course, is introduced to the long history of the profession. And it's no different than with forestry schools. You're going to get some of that background. You have to know where the profession has been to have an understanding where you are today, and you know, to project ahead.
One would think so.
Well, Nicholas, thanks for that question. And Laurence, thanks again for this absolutely wonderful presentation.